So far, we've briefly discussed economics, our economic system, how supply and demand works, true costs, internal costs, and external costs, and how the failure to internalize external costs is a flaw in our free market system. Further, we defined the concept of an ecological footprint and gave you an opportunity, through this week's assignment, to calculate your personal environmental footprint. Lastly, we're going to look at how we measure a country's economic performance. How do we tell if our economy is better or worse than last year? How do we compare one country to another? Well, one way it's done is through a measurement called the gross domestic product. GDP has historically been one of our most important economic indicators, if not our most important economic indicator, and it's used elsewhere around the world as well. GDP represents the total dollar value of all goods and services produced over a specific period of time. And we use GDP to compare us to other countries or to see how we're doing over time. Like on the bottom, the graph on the bottom left shows US GDP from one year to the next, and the graph on the bottom right shows GDP percent change from one quarter to another. So we use GDP to measure our whole country's economy. It can also be used at the state level as well. So if the GDP is up 2% from one quarter to the next, we generally say the economy has grown 2% during that period. So again, we're using the GDP to indicate the health of our country's economy. Unfortunately, GDP has several flaws. Before I get into the specific flaws that I'm going to mention here, I want to relate one analogy that I think is pretty telling. GDP can be thought of as a speedometer, telling how fast our economy is going. But just like a speedometer tells how fast a car is going, it does nothing to show us the health of the car, or even if the car is going in the right direction. So similarly, the GDP of our country might tell us how fast our economy is moving, but it doesn't tell us about the real health of our economy, whether the economy is serving the needs of the people, and whether the economy is going in the right direction. Okay, let's move on to some specific flaws. First, anything that increases the flow of money is treated as a positive, even if it has a negative impact on society. Another way of saying this is that it doesn't make any distinction between beneficial and harmful economic activity. For example, the sale of guns, even to children, would be considered positive for the GDP. Or the cleanup after a massive oil spill or nuclear accident might also add to GDP. Additionally, war may even add to GDP. Second, GDP does not account for the depletion of natural resources. Really, this is similar to number one above, but it focuses on natural resources. There's no deduction for using up a resource. In companies, as equipment ages, the value is depreciated. But for GDP, we have no method of changing the value of the resource as it becomes scarcer. Chopping down the first tree and chopping down the last tree are treated equally. Further, accelerating the extraction of oil or the chopping down of trees is seen as a good thing, even if it's being done non-sustainably, and is actually destroying the use of that resource for the future. So poor countries may race to exploit their natural resources in an attempt to increase their GDP. Related to number 2 above and number 4 that we're going to have below, GDP does not account for pollution. It does not attach a value to a clear, clean river or clean air. So environmentally degrading processes are economically favored compared to processes that have less economic gain but pollute less. Ideally, we would subtract the environmental degradation from GDP and add in activities that improve the environment. Fourth, GDP doesn't value things not in the marketplace. Again, this is related to number 1 above, but I wanted to elaborate. Transactions based on caring relationships or home production are not valued. Staying home to care for your kids or sharing childcare duties with neighbors contribute nothing to GDP. but sending your kid to daycare does. Also, exchanging homegrown fruits and vegetables in your neighborhood or creating a tool lending library in your community would also not be valued. Fifth, GDP does not take into account the distribution of income and wealth. Growth in incomes of a few billionaires can create massive growth in GDP in some countries, even if a majority of the country are starving or falling further into poverty. And lastly, GDP does not distinguish between real income and the income generated from financial transactions. Financial speculation can lead to impressive stock market growth and profits simply due to financial transactions rather than the creation of something of real value. Over the last few decades, we've seen financial bubbles grow, and thus our GDP grows, only to have it crash and have disastrous effects on society. So these are just a few of the flaws associated with GDP. GDP is used around the world, and economists around the world know that it is not a great measure of the country's actual progress or economic health, but it continues to be used. Are there solutions? Are there better ways to measure an economy's health or an economy's progress than GDP? Yes. Yes, in fact, there are robust discussions around the world on what alternatives we could use to measuring a country's economy. Here's a few links. The first 3 links here are from the World Economic Forum that occurs every year, and they had a focus group on beyond the GDP. This top one is the main link, and these two actually link from that same page. These are very readable, one-page discussions of aspects related to GDP and alternatives to GDP. This fourth one here has to do with what's being done in some of the states in the United States as an alternative to using GDP. Here in the United States, the leading alternative to GDP is the GPI, the Genuine Progress Indicator. And this link here is interesting because they list about 8 or 10 different indicators that are used as an alternative to GDP in different countries around the world. Lastly, Story of Solutions is a video done by the same folks that did Story of Stuff, which you were asked to watch for a discussion board assignment this week. Story of Solutions specifically deals with alternatives to measuring our economy with GDP. Check it out.